Welcome to episode 83 of the MMA Rundown podcast. It's been a couple of weeks that have been off. Been pretty busy, but we're back here. So we'll be talking about UFC 255 for the most part on this one. We'll be recapping the main event between Deiveson Figueiredo and Alex Perez, the co-main between Valentina Shevchenko, Jennifer Maia, then the rest of the card, previewing the upcoming card that's coming next week, which is going to be headlined by Blaydes and Derek Lewis. There were a bunch of fights that were announced over the course of the week, so I'll recap some of those, some big ones for the UFC. Give an update on where wrestling is at right now, or at least college wrestling. Got some pretty bad news with the Ivy League with their season being canceled, so that takes out schools like Cornell, who have some guys who are definitely up there and could contend for national titles this year, assuming that there still is a season. And then for jiu-jitsu, we got the no-gi pans going on right now. I'm actually watching it as I record. Lucas Barboza actually just finished off his match and won gold. So I'll recap some of the results there as well. So back to the top, we have the main event, UFC 255, which was between Deiveson Figueiredo and Alex Perez. And this was a very interesting fight to me because I felt like Perez had a really good shot at winning this fight. I figured that his wrestling would be enough where he could take the fight to the ground. Would probably be able to stay out of submissions for the most part, I would have figured. And on the feet, we saw in that last fight against Formiga where he was very effective with that low leg kick, and oftentimes Figueiredo will take a wide stance out of orthodox for the most part. And that leg kick opening could be there. So it's one of those things where it's like if Figueiredo fights this like he fights most fights, he could be in trouble with the leg kicks. And Perez mixing the takedowns could cause some problems for him too. But Figueiredo came out and it looked like he was very well prepared for it. He realized that Formiga was getting hit a lot from the orthodox stance with those leg kicks, so he came out in southpaw for the most part, even though Figueiredo is mostly an orthodox fighter. So it was limiting the opportunity for Perez to find those kicks. On the feet, the exchanges were fairly even. I think it looks like the final total strike count was 6-5 in favor of Perez. So both of them were landing a little bit here and there. But the leg kicks weren't there as much as I think Perez would have liked, especially after that fight with Formiga. But eventually Perez does come in for a takedown. Perez knows going into this fight that Figueiredo's got a great guillotine. So then rather than like diving his head into Figueiredo's hip and trying to take him down that way, he switches to a single, kind of pulls the leg out, and then just starts going for more of a trip takedown. Figueiredo does a good job of keeping his balance, and then while he's balancing up near the fence, ends up diving for a leg. One of the things I saw online is that in this process, when Figueiredo was defending the takedown prior to diving for the leg, that he did grab the cage a couple times. Yes, it's illegal to grab the cage. Do I think that it had any kind of effect on what happened afterwards? Not really. I mean, I guess maybe he could have been taken down right off of it and never would have been able to enter into the legs. But the actual finish itself really wasn't affected at all by the cage grab. So if you're if you want to point out the cage grab, it's fair, it happened. But if you want to act as though it is the reason why Figueiredo got the win here, I think that is going way too far with that. But either way, Figueiredo dives on the leg lock, barely has control above Perez's knee. Perez does a good job of keeping his foot flat on the mat while he's standing up, is able to clear the knee line. And then once he clears the knee line, basically doesn't have Figueiredo's back to the point where he has like the hooks in, but he is behind Figueiredo, but sort of like has his weight down a little bit too much on him. So then Figueiredo rolls back into him, and as he rolls back into him, he wraps his arm around, catches the neck. It was a very nice setup by Figueiredo to catch that neck. A lot of times when you catch it like that, it's not easy to finish from there, but Figueiredo's so good and has so many little details that he mixes into his arm and guillotine that he was able to make an adjustment after he caught the neck initially to be able to tighten up the choke and eventually get the tap. So he does get a hold of the neck, turns back in, gets into guard, closes the guard with the guillotine choke, starts to crunch in as you should with an arm and guillotine choke, gets some pressure. Perez is pulling his head out. And it's one of those things with these guillotine chokes sometimes where it's like when your head's almost out, sometimes that's where like the choke really bites down the hardest. Like you just need to like get that extra inch just to get your head out and then you're out. But if you can't get that extra inch, then it's like the choke's like even tighter and even more uncomfortable. And that's sort of the spot that Perez got stuck in. So he was trying to wedge his way out, but Figueiredo had a great squeeze, did a good job of crunching inwards and making it as tight as he possibly could. And Perez was forced to tap. So big win for Deiveson Figueiredo. Took basically no damage in the fight. Showed a couple really cool jiu-jitsu transitions. So great performance by him. Immediately after the fight, he calls for another fight with Brandon Moreno. Moreno got a win over Brandon Royval, which I'll get to earlier on in the night. Moreno was the number one contender. Moreno probably should have had this title fight last night. If Moreno was prepared and able to fight on November 21st, and Figueiredo was defending his title on November 21st, I don't understand the point of having the number 4 guy get the title shot instead. Maybe they had the Moreno fight already made and they didn't want to break it up and put Perez in there against Royval instead. I don't know if that was the thinking there, but it seems like Moreno probably should have had the shot to begin with, but either way, he gets the win, and he's going to earn a title fight, and it looks like that fight will be in 3 weeks at UFC 256. The co-main event between Shevchenko and Maia. I mean, this fight was not anywhere near as close as the announced team made it out to be. They also made it sound like Jennifer Maia did a much better job than she really did. On the feet, Maia really didn't land a whole lot at all. On the ground, Maia, for the most part, was put on her back when Maia was on top. It's not as though she was like passing Shevchenko's guard or getting any really good ground and pound off. She was just kind of controlling the top position for the time, which I guess is enough for her to win some minutes on the clock and be able to win the round. But it's not as though, like, while watching that fight, it's like, oh my goodness, Maia might be able to get a finish here. Maia's, like, really doing some damage. It was just like Maia, by ending up on top in the second round, was able to win a few minutes, and by winning those minutes, won the round. Like, that was her big accomplishment in the fight. It's not like she was ever hurting Shevchenko with strikes. It's not like she was ever putting Shevchenko in positional danger where she can get caught somewhere. The biggest thing that Maia did was get on top and then maintain top position while not having a ton of offense from there. For Shevchenko on the feet, it seems like for the most part she did a good job of landing strikes when they were in the middle of the cage. What was sort of odd to me is that she was a little bit more willing to grapple with Maia than she probably should have been. I understand that she felt like she had the advantage in the takedown game, and that really showed. She was able to get on top of Maia much more often than Maia was able to get on top of her. And once she was on top, she was positionally solid enough to stay out of trouble. Now, with that being said, she was also not giving Maia a ton of trouble on top either. But she was staying out of trouble for the most part. But again, it's like I don't know why she was so willing to engage in the grappling when it seems like a better strategy for her would have just been try to keep your back off the fence, land some shots, circle out. Like, for the most part, when they were on the feet, she was doing a good job of that. Especially in the later round, she was doing a pretty good job of not getting too far behind the double black lines, pivoting off of her strikes and getting back to the center every time she did land. And it felt like that would have been a better strategy for her to just keep doing the entire time rather than grappling. But when she did grapple, she would get on top. I think the ref could have done a much better job about doing stand-ups in this fight. Typically when someone is on top of the other fighter, what you are looking for as a ref is you want to see that the person on top is making progress towards the finish, whether that means that they were progressing position where they're getting closer to a position where they can find a submission. So if you're on top of guard, you pass to half guard, then you pass to side control, then you start working for the back. You start looking for maybe Kimuras if you're on side control. If you get mount, maybe looking for some chokes there. You get the back, you're looking for chokes. Like, you want to see a constant positional progression towards the submission. Or if they're still going to be in the same position, you want to at least see them putting themselves in a position where they can land ground and pound that is significant enough where they could potentially end a fight. So if you're just digging your head into your opponent's chest on top of guard, throwing arm punches, you're not ending a fight with that. If you're posturing up every so often and landing some big elbows, okay, that's something you're actually making progress towards what could potentially lead to a finish. But if you're just keeping your posture down the entire time and just throwing arm punches and yelling a couple of times to make it sound like you're trying hard, that shouldn't be enough to have the ref allow that to keep going over and over and over again. It seemed like the refs were a little bit more willing than they should have been to allow that to continue. But either way, that was a good way for Shevchenko to stay on top and win some minutes, and as a result, she ends up doing enough to win the fight here. As far as what's next for her, listening to Dana White in the post-fight press conference, he sounds like he's very interested in seeing the Andrade fight, and I could see why he's interested in that, because we did see Jennifer Maia get on top of Shevchenko, and Shevchenko not be able to get up immediately or offer a ton of danger off of her back. Now, with that being said, part of that's because Maia was effectively stalling from top. She wasn't doing a whole lot when she was there. It is worth mentioning with Shevchenko that if you want to think about what her ability is to fight off of her back, there was that fight that she had at bantamweight against, I'm trying to think what her name is, Juliana Pena, I believe, where Pena was a pretty good grappler. Pena got on top of Shevchenko, and Shevchenko caught an armbar on her finisher. So Shevchenko does have attacks off her back, especially if you're willing to like engage and posture up and try to actually play offense with her. Not to say that she's like a killer off her back, but she does have offense from there that we didn't really get to see in this fight. But the idea with Andrade is that Andrade is very good at running girls up against the fence, very powerful up there, can toss girls around, get on top, lands serious ground and pound, can advance position. So the idea is that if Maia was able to take Shevchenko down, that Andrade could also take her down, but Andrade would be a lot more dangerous on top than what Maia was. And maybe that's what we'll see when these two fight. It'll also be interesting to see what sort of Andrade shows up on the feet. So we've seen the Andrade who just kind of bowls forward and just fights recklessly, like in the first Namajunas fight. And in that fight, she was getting lit up on the feet prior to eventually getting Namajunas up against the cage and getting that slam that ended up finishing the fight. In the second fight, Andrade was a lot more patient, but was also still getting outpointed there and having trouble there. So if Andrade just tries to bull in on Shevchenko, she can get caught coming in and get put out that way. If she tries to play a technical striking match with Shevchenko, that could be trouble for her too, because Shevchenko is going to be better at that than Andrade will. So for Andrade, she's going to have to try to find similar success to what Maia did in the second round, at least being able to get on top. But then you would have to hope for Andrade that she's able to actually keep Shevchenko down and land some really big strikes in there. I would still bet on Shevchenko in that fight, but I guess if you're looking for holes in Shevchenko's game, obviously there aren't going to be many girls at 125, if any, who are going to have an advantage on the feet. If there's going to be an advantage anywhere, it's going to be on the ground. Shevchenko's fought some pretty good grapplers. She fought Carmouche, who was a black belt. She just fought Maia, who was a black belt. Shevchenko herself is not a black belt, but she's still very positionally solid. I think Chookagian was a brown belt when they fought. So she's been fine with a lot of good grapplers and been able to stay safe in most positions. So I guess the hope again with Andrade is that Andrade, also a black belt, could give her some problems. There is a path to victory for Andrade, but I don't see her being successful in it. So I still think Shevchenko would win that fight, and at that point, you're really looking for girls who Shevchenko is going to have trouble with, that you aren't going to make Shevchenko a 10-1 favorite or more on. They're also talking about Zhang Weili potentially, if she defends her title, to eventually put her in there against Shevchenko. That could be a fight to watch later as well. Fight before Shevchenko-Maia was Mike Perry versus Tim Means. Perry had a very difficult weight cut. Could be in part to the fact that he was not really eating all that well for most of the week, but whatever the case may be, comes into this fight with Tim Means, has Latoya Gonzalez in his corner, unlike the fight with Mickey Gall, where Mickey Gall really isn't quite UFC level at this point anyway. And Perry could just kind of go in there and do whatever the hell he wanted. With Tim Means, he had a much tougher opponent and wasn't able to do the same. Now, with that being said, it was interesting to see Perry come out and grapple right away. It seems like he's found a few takedowns up against the cage that he's very effective with. Was able to get Means down. Was able to pass Means' guard and able to take his back pretty early on. I was pretty impressed by how Perry looked in the grappling in the first half of the first round. Nearly had Means caught in a rear naked choke. Means was able to get out, get on top. And then from there, a lot of the fight after that took place on the feet. Means was the longer fighter, was being very effective. Was having a lot of success with his lead right hand, both with the jab and the hook, to keep Perry at a distance. Was finding homes for the straight left every so often, but for Perry, he was mostly looking for that right hand. Means was wise to it and was able to stay out of the way for the most part. Did take a couple of hard right hands later on in the fight, but was able to outland Perry for the most part and was able to get the win here. Fight before that was Caitlin Chookagian versus Cynthia Calvillo. Put the fight on mute after a couple minutes and kind of tuned out, so apparently Chookagian won this fight, but I really can't recap it that well because I just can't stand this Chookagian girl. Like, I guess it's nice to watch a fight like Valentina Shevchenko or Jessica Andrade, where they just beat her and you don't have to hear all the constant yelling and screaming and just obnoxiousness. But when Chookagian's on her game, she's just fighting girls at a distance and just grunting when she's throwing shots, grunting when she's not throwing shots. It's tough. It's kind of funny. Darren Till put up a tweet where it's kind of like a meme with Michael Jordan from The Last Dance, where he was pulling out the headphones and it was like when you put your mic on mute, but you can still hear Chookagian's grunts. I think a lot of people were feeling the same way, where they couldn't stand it anymore. And it's kind of a shame for Chookagian too, because she's just like a decent looking girl. Like, she could be pretty popular. She's a decent looking girl. She's top 3, top 5 in her division, but she's so unwatchable because of all the constant grunting. And it's just like, I don't know why this happened. It seems like it happens a lot more in the women's divisions than it does in the men's. Now, I think Jordan Wright was doing some grunting too when he was fighting against Joaquin Buckley, and that's annoying as well. But for whatever reason, there are just some fighters that just have to make so much fucking noise in there, and it's so annoying. Like, it's one thing if they're like talking shit and it's kind of funny, but just the constant grunting and yelling, it's tough to listen to. So that's my recap of that fight. Basically, nothing technical. It was just recap there. It was just, I'm annoyed by Caitlin Chookagian's grunting. That was my recap. But I think for a lot of you probably feel the same. So there's that. And then the first fight on the pay-per-view card was Paul Craig versus Shogun Rua. Shogun looked just really bad in this fight. Wasn't throwing many kicks. Was trying to win this fight with his right hand for the most part, but wasn't really doing a great job of setting it up. Got taken down a couple times. Looked kind of slow on the ground as well. Eventually Craig was able to get him down again in the second round. Shogun immediately kind of like turtles up and tries to work his way back, but was very slow about it. So Craig's able to sink in both hooks, take the back, flatten him out, lands a bunch of punches, and then just kind of in a tough way, you see Shogun tapping to strikes, which you feel like, for what Shogun's reputation was, the idea of him tapping to strikes just seems like something that you wouldn't ever really expect from him. So to see it here, it was just tough to watch, and you would hope this is going to be it for Shogun, that he's not going to want to fight after this. He's had a great career. He's done a lot of great things. This is just kind of a tough fight to see, because it's not like Paul Craig, though he is ranked in the top 15 now, which I think is crazy. He might be one of like the worst ranked fighters in the UFC. The guy is he either, like, for the most part in his UFC career to this point, aside from the Shogun fights, like, either is getting finished badly or is getting the shit beat out of him and then just, like, catches the choke after taking an ass whooping. Like, he is... The fact that he's worked his way into the top 15 is kind of crazy. It's kind of crazy that he has a win over Ankalaev, which was one of those fights where Ankalaev was beating him for, like, 14 and a half minutes and then gets caught in the last second. But he got the win here and, again, was able to get another win against Shogun Rua. So for him, he's going to be facing some other ranked fighters soon, I'm sure. I can't imagine that he's going to be very successful in those fights. But for him, I guess good for him. Good for him for getting into the top 15. Good for him for getting a win over another guy who was ranked in the top 15 in Shogun. Obviously, light heavyweight's not the deepest division for both of these guys to be ranked in the top 15. Shogun's probably going to be out of the rankings now. Paul Craig is going to stay in the rankings, but you figure at some point soon he'll probably get knocked out of it again. But for Craig, he does have a decent grappling. You got to give him that. The striking could definitely use a lot of work. The wrestling, I mean, it looked fine here against Shogun, but Shogun didn't exactly look all that great. So I guess congrats to Craig for getting the win for Shogun. Hopefully that's all for him, at least in the UFC. Maybe if he wants to, like, fight some other really old guys who aren't going to really push him that much in another promotion, and he wants to keep fighting, like, hey, that's his choice. He's an adult, but I don't really want to see him fighting UFC level guys or even borderline UFC level guys at this point. On the prelims, we had a fight between Brandon Moreno and Brandon Royval. This was a really fun fight for as long as it lasted. Royval has really been impressing me a lot lately, even though this fight didn't go his way. Like, he's very offensive-minded. Like, defensively, he definitely leaves openings for guys to catch him and hurt him. But the offense is just so constant that sometimes people kind of shell up and they get overwhelmed. I'm not saying that's what happened to Moreno here. But Moreno was having a hard time early on getting his reads on Royval, just because Royval would kind of come in with these wild knees every so often that would catch Moreno. On the feet, it seemed like it was relatively competitive early on. Moreno was able to get Royval down. I don't remember what the setup was. I think Royval went for some sort of spinning attack, and then Moreno went behind him on that. But either way, was able to get his back. Had a position where Joe Rogan was just screwing for a twister that never came. But still, there was a good attempt at a rear naked choke that Royval was able to defend. But towards the end of the round, they're on the ground again. Royval is on his back, and it looks like he was rolling for like a leg lock and did something to his shoulder. Apparently, he's had issues with this before where his shoulder pops out. But his shoulder did pop out there at the end of the round. He was just kind of like curled up into a ball, trying to make it through the last 10 seconds, hopefully to get to his corner and have his shoulder pop back in. But he wasn't really effectively defending himself. The ref was telling him, hey, you got to do something. He wasn't really doing much. He was just taking more hammer from Moreno. So the ref steps in, calls a stop to the fight, and Moreno wins by TKO with 1 second left in the first round. So for Moreno heading in, he was the number one contender. He gets the win here. He's still the number one contender. For Royval, it kind of sucks because had he gotten the win here, maybe he's fighting for a title in 3 weeks from now. But instead, he's still kind of like one of those guys who's probably not going to move much in the rankings. I actually was more impressed with him after watching this fight that he lost than I was headed in, just because the Elliott fight was sort of back and forth. Elliott had his moments where he was getting close to beating Royval before Royval eventually got the win there, and then the Kai Kara-France fight was another back and forth fight. So it's one of those things where it's like you see this guy in a couple back and forth fights. He beat some good guys. You're like, okay, how good is he really? Moreno's a guy I'm pretty high on, so the fact that Royval looked really good early on in this fight tells me that Royval can definitely hang with the best guys in the division. So I'm more impressed with him now than I was headed in. But he's not moving up in the same way that maybe he could have had he not had his shoulder pop out here and had a chance to fight a little bit more. Fight before that, we had Jordan Wright versus Joaquin Buckley. Buckley was able to walk Wright down a lot, was able to land some pretty heavy left hands in the first round, had Wright hurt really bad towards the end of the round. Wright somehow survives, just hanging on to a double leg at the end there. Then they come out for the second, and pretty quickly Buckley's able to drop him again with the left hand, gets his finish. So big one for Joaquin Buckley after the fight. Sort of a weird call out. Thankfully, Joe Rogan saved this for him. Usually if you're going to call someone out, you want to call them out by name so people know what you're talking about, so they know what to look for. For Joaquin Buckley, if you are Joaquin Buckley, then you're very well aware of who Joaquin Buckley is beefing with and who doesn't like Joaquin Buckley. But if you are just a general MMA fan, you probably don't know all that, so it's probably best if you are Joaquin Buckley to tell everyone who that person is. So you're saying, oh, hey, there's this guy talking shit about me online. I actually did know about the James Krause thing. I didn't actually put two and two together. It wasn't until Joe Rogan said you're talking about James Krause, and then Buckley sort of like nodded as if like, yeah, that's who it is, but I don't want to say his name because I don't want to give him any attention, which again is weird. If you're going to have a big fight, it's kind of important that your opponent gets some attention. Like, if Conor McGregor is fighting Dustin Poirier, which he is, like, it doesn't make sense for Conor McGregor to be like, hey guys, I'm fighting, but don't worry about who I'm fighting. Like you want to tell a story, you want it to be like, hey, I'm fighting Dustin Poirier. The reason why you want to care about this fight against Dustin Poirier is, and then you can go into a backstory that involves Dustin Poirier. So if you're Joaquin Buckley and you want to sell this fight with James Krause, then it's kind of important to name James Krause and explain to everybody why you and James Krause don't like each other. Now, as far as this fight being made, I don't think that's very likely because I think that James Krause just had that fight with Claudio Silva and his knee got torn up in that fight. Typically with those, it's like a 6 to 8 month recovery. Krause seems like the kind of guy who would fight with a knee injury, but I would like to think that he's not going to be back until like middle of next year at the earliest. Plus, he was talking about even before the injury was an issue, that he had a lot of people that he had to coach and had a lot of interest there. So I don't think that the January 23rd date works for him anyway. But now that we are a little bit more aware of the Joaquin Buckley and James Krause beef, at least now that we know that Joaquin Buckley has heard what Krause has to say and wants to fight James Krause, it does make that fight more interesting. I just don't know whether or not it's going to be feasible to put that one together just because of Krause's injury from the Silva fight. Before that, we had Antonina Shevchenko versus Ariane Lipski. Shevchenko was able to get this fight to the ground a couple times. Late in the second round, was able to get Lipski down. Sort of had her back, not like with both hooks in, but was like off to the side, was landing a bunch of shots. Lipski was in an improving position. Shevchenko was being very audible about each of the strikes she was landing, but it's not as though the ref stepped in too early. Lipski was in an improving position, but that was also quite the moment there where Shevchenko was landing shot after shot. Eventually gets the win by TKO in the second round, and then also gets a performance of the night bonus. Then a fight between Daniel Rodriguez and Nicholas Dalby. I wasn't watching this fight close enough to judge it. Based on what I was hearing, it sounded like Rodriguez was probably edging out Dalby, but I wasn't watching it close enough where I could say this is a robbery, but it seems like a lot of people thought that Rodriguez had done enough to win most of the rounds here to get the win, but Dalby ends up getting the decision instead by a unanimous decision, so every judge agreed. And then on the early prelims, we had Alan Jouban versus Jared Gooden. Pretty good striking battle here. Jouban landed some pretty hard left hands. Jouban was fighting out of southpaw. Gooden was fighting out of orthodox. Gooden was keeping his lead left hand down the entire time, and Jouban just was constantly throwing right hooks. Like it's just kind of ridiculous just to like watch Jouban's right hand for most of the fight. Like he was throwing some jabs later on in the third round, but it was just like it was like every few seconds, like he was either throwing a right hook, like an actual full right hook, or he was kind of like making that motion, like pulling himself back, as if like he was just like reflexively throwing the right hook just because he kept seeing it. But Jouban was able to land a lot on Gooden, in part because the opening was there for the right hand, but then he was also finding a home for the straight left. Landed some good kicks in there as well. Gooden was able to land some pretty hard right hands himself, but Jouban was able to take him pretty well, was definitely outlanding Gooden and got the win there. Kyle Daukaus versus Dustin Stoltzfus. This fight kind of sucked. The worst kind of fight to watch is a fight where one of the guys really wants to take the other guy down, but he doesn't really have the wrestling capability to take him down. And for the most part, that's kind of what this fight was. Daukaus did actually get a takedown in the first round, but there was a lot of clinch work up against the fence. Daukaus never really seemed to want to get his head down towards Stoltzfus's hips and actually like shoot up for like a single or a double. It seemed like everything that he wanted to do was just upper body takedowns. He got the one early on, but after that, he was having a lot of trouble getting Stoltzfus down. So we were just seeing a lot of grinding up against the cage. Not a lot of powerful strikes being thrown, not a lot of successful takedowns. So especially after the first fight of the night, it's a bit of a less exciting fight. But again, Daukaus was in control position for most of the fight, and that's why he ended up getting the win. And then the first fight of the night, we had Louis Kasia versus Sasha Plotnikov. This fight was just a wild brawl. I was kind of surprised that Koski, or C-O-S-E, however Lewis's last name is pronounced, kind of surprised he didn't get the win in the first round. It looked like one of those fights where, especially with Nevada, which I kind of hate, where it's like, I think Kosi might be how it's pronounced. I'm just going to go with Kosi from now on. I think Kosi, when he had Plotnikov hurt, he was just hammering him over and over again to the back of the head. And a lot of times, it's a tough spot for a ref, because if you see a guy who gets legitimately hurt, you don't want to stop the fight while they're just recovering if you see one or two shots to the back of the head, because it's kind of like, is that necessarily fair to, like, penalize the guy who hurt his opponent just because a couple shots landed to the back of the head? So sometimes fighters will get away with those shots. There were a lot of shots that Kosi was getting away with in this fight. But Plotnikov, despite taking a lot of shots to the back of the head while he was hurt, was able to get up and get out of trouble. And then from there, after the first 2 to 3 minutes, they were brawling a little bit less. The punches were definitely coming slower. Plotnikov was starting to take over a little bit more. And then late in the third round, Plotnikov lands a huge right hand. To exit the exchange, Koshi is sort of stuck up against the fence, so he can't completely get out of the pocket. So then Plotnikov comes right back in with another right hand, hurts Kosi. Kosi shoots in for a double leg. Problem that Kosi was having a lot in this fight is that whenever he would shoot for a single takedown, if that first takedown got stuffed, he never really transitioned to the next takedown. He would just kind of like stay in place and just try to like reset and go back to standing. So again, he shoots that double leg. The double leg gets stuffed. It's not like he tries to cut an angle or switch to a different takedown. He just kind of like stays down. Then he's in this position where he can kind of plop back to his back and then try to lean up against the fence and work his way up. I guess he didn't want to be on bottom at all. So instead, just kind of stays there turtle. Plotnikov just starts landing shots to each side of his head while Kosi is moving his head side to side. Then he goes from just moving his head side to side to then covering up, and once he starts covering up, then the ref steps in and stops the fight, and Plotnikov gets the win. So that covers it for that. That obviously ended up being fight of the night. It was a very, very fun fight, especially early on. So that covers it for UFC 255. For the upcoming fight card, we have UFC Fight Night, Blaydes versus Lewis. This will also be in Vegas. Obviously, the headliner is Curtis Blaydes versus Derek Lewis. A lot of people, myself included, are under the assumption that this fight is going to look relatively similar to what we saw with Cormier versus Lewis, and that Blaydes is probably going to get in there and try to wrestle Lewis immediately. He's not going to mess around too much with the stand-up. The assumption is that Blaydes will be successful in getting this fight to the ground, at which point, for Lewis, he's had a lot of success in this, and it's kind of weird to this point in his career that when he gets taken down, he'll kind of let people pass his guard and get on top of side control, and then he's very good at exploding up and getting out from side control. Curtis Blaydes, he will pass guard, but it kind of seems like with him, he is very happy to just be in someone's full guard or in someone's half guard, and to just ground and pound from there. And I have a feeling that he is doing his research. He does know that Derek Lewis likes to explode out of side control. I have a feeling that Blaydes is just going to be perfectly fine staying inside of Derek Lewis's guard, landing elbows, and working his way towards the finish from there. I don't think if he does find an opening to pass the guard and get to mount, or especially if he can get to the back, I'm sure he'll take it. But I would expect him to maybe turn down some opportunities to pass the side control just to stay in Lewis's guard, so he has a little bit more control over Lewis's legs, and then just laying ground and pound from there. And either he's just going to wear him out over time, or he's going to land some serious shots early on and be able to get a finish off of that. But I think Blaydes is going to get some I think he'll be very successful in getting his takedowns, and I think once he gets on top, he'll be pretty effective at just constantly landing from top, doing enough to cause damage to either force a stop or at least allow the ref to continue the fight and not stand him back up. Co-main event is Anthony Smith versus Devin Clark. I guess the assumption here is that after Smith has suffered a few consecutive losses, that Clark would be the type of guy that he can get a win over. Clark's got some decent wrestling. I don't know if that's going to be enough for him to take Smith down on the feet. Smith should have the advantage. That's definitely the more powerful striker, so we'll see how that fight goes. Rest of the card, not a ton of big names. A lot of other guys who I guess you would consider prospects that are scattered throughout. So we got Parker Porter versus Josh Perezian. I think Perezian's coming off of the Contender Series. Porter, he's got a record of 10-6. I think he's one of John Jones' old training partners. I believe he fought against Kyle Douglas' brother in his last fight. Didn't look particularly good. Then we got Amir Albazi versus Zalgis Zumagulov. We got Miguel Baeza versus Takashi Sato, which is actually going to be a really fun fight. Baeza, undefeated, really good prospect. I think he's a black belt in jiu-jitsu. Pretty good striker, really good kicks. Sato's got excellent boxing, really good 1-2 out of the southpaw stance. So we'll see how that fight goes. But that's definitely going to be a fun one to watch for. And Spike Carlisle versus Bill Algeo is the last one on the main card. Prelims, this would be a fantastic fight, but I think it got pushed back to UFC 256. Renato Moicano versus Rafael Fiziev. But I'm pretty sure that fight's not happening next week, so I'm not going to go into that. Gina Mazzani versus the 4-5 Rachel Ostovich, who has her fans for obvious reasons, and that is why she still is fighting in the UFC at 4-5. So I guess the hope would be that she gets a win here, so the UFC feels like they have a reason to keep her around. Speaking of women who are in the UFC largely because of their looks, we got Norma Dumont. Now at 4-1, so I guess she was in the UFC at 4-0, but she is mostly known for her backside. She'll be fighting Ashley Evans Smith. Didn't realize that Ashley Evans Smith was still in the UFC. She's 6-4 now. I feel like it's been a while since I've seen her in the UFC, but she'll be back on this card. We got Martin Day versus Anderson Dos Santos. I don't know a ton about them. Sue Maderji versus Malcolm Gordon, and Luke Sanders versus Nate Manis. So that covers it for the upcoming UFC Fight Night Blaydes versus Lewis card. Next thing to talk about is a few different fights that have been announced. a couple of them are for next month in December, and then one of them is for a main event in January. So I'll start with one that's for December 12th. And I've effectively already mentioned that the Brandon Moreno versus Deiveson Figueiredo fight was announced as well, so I'm not going to cover that again here. But another fight that is announced on that card is the return of Tony Ferguson, who's now coming back after that fight that he had with Justin Gaethje. He was hoping to get Michael Chandler. I was kind of hoping that he would get Michael Chandler. That would have been a more fun matchup, at least for me, because the guy that he is matched up with is a guy who I am sort of rooting for. I like Tony Ferguson. I also like Charles Oliveira. So it's going to suck to see one of these guys lose, especially where both of them are at, because I feel like I'd like to see both of them eventually get a shot at the title. But the loser is not going to be fighting for the title anytime soon, you wouldn't figure. So for Tony Ferguson, he's been in that title picture for a long time, but has never really gotten that title shot. It seems like whenever he gets a title shot, the champion isn't available, so then he has to fight for an interim title. He did beat Kevin Lee to get the interim title the first time. Then had the other interim title fight against Justin Gaethje that would have given him a chance at Khabib, but then fell to Justin Gaethje. So if he gets the win here, there's a decent chance that he might find himself in the title picture. Khabib and Dana White are going to meet sometime soon. I think the idea is that if Khabib, who is still saying that he is retired, if Khabib is going to confirm that, if he's going to back out of the USADA program, then there's a decent chance, I would think, that the Conor McGregor versus Dustin Poirier fight that's announced for January is going to be converted into a title fight, because they are doing it at lightweight. But if not, if it remains a non-title fight, then it seems like the winner of that fight is going to have one spot in whatever the next title fight is. And the winner of this fight here with Charles Oliveira and Tony Ferguson could very well find themselves in the other spot in that fight. So there are more shoes that have to fall here before we really know what's going on with the lightweight title picture. But it's very possible that this could be a title eliminator here. Or, if we really want to go crazy, we could say that the current UFC 255 card, or 256 card, only has one title fight on it. It's the flyweight title fight. I mean, I can't imagine that UFC 255 did the best numbers right now with Deiveson Figueiredo versus Alex Perez and then Shevchenko in the co-main event. So you have two title fights on that card. The numbers probably weren't the best. For 256, if you have one title fight on the card, you can't imagine that Figueiredo or Moreno are both big pay-per-view names. I mean, if you could put a belt on this Tony Ferguson fight against Charles Oliveira, you would figure that's gonna help sell that pay-per-view a little bit more, and the UFC might be thinking that too. So this is not me making that announcement. I'm just saying keep this in mind. If Dana White meets with Khabib Nurmagomedov sometime soon, Khabib confirms, hey, I'm not coming back, and now Dana has the option of, do I want to put a belt on the Ferguson versus Oliveira fight and really strengthen the UFC 256 card as a result of that? Or do I want to put a belt on the Conor McGregor fight, even though Conor McGregor is still just fine with Donald Cerrone without a belt available? It is a possibility that we could potentially see this fight converted to a title fight. Now, again, there might be more that has to happen with that. If they are signed for a 3-round fight at this point, that's the decision they're going to have to make soon, because they're then going to have to convert it to a 5-round fight and get both guys to agree on it. But it doesn't seem like it's out of the realm of possibility just yet that this Ferguson versus Oliveira fight could be for a title. Do I think it will be? I don't think so. I think this will just be a top contenders fight. But that's the story to keep an eye on. As far as how it goes, Oliveira has improved a lot on the feet over time. His jiu-jitsu has always been very good. That's improved over time as well. But on the feet, he's going to throw a lot of straight shots at Ferguson. Ferguson does leave openings for those. If Ferguson puts a lot of pressure on Oliveira, it'll be interesting to see how Oliveira handles that, because Oliveira is one of those guys where he can, if you pressure him up against the fence, he'll happily pull guard and be fine. And for most guys, that's a bad position to be in against a guy like Tony Ferguson. You don't want to be pulling guard against a guy like him. If you're Oliveira, maybe not the worst idea. So it'll be interesting to see how he handles Ferguson's pressure. He's put a lot of pressure on his opponents. It'll be interesting to see if he tries to do the same thing with Ferguson and sort of play a similar game to Gaethje. Definitely throws straighter punches than Gaethje does for the most part. Has a lot more kicks and knees in his game than Gaethje. Gaethje does have the leg kicks, but Gaethje doesn't really throw a bunch of body kicks or go to the head as much as Oliveira does. So it's going to be an interesting matchup. I'm definitely curious to see how it goes. I'm probably going to want to do a little bit more research on Oliveira, just because he's been fighting in the UFC for so long. He's made a lot of improvements over time. So just putting some time into to see how those improvements have really shown themselves in the octagon over time would be interesting. But this is definitely a fight I look forward to. Kind of wish both guys could win, because I want to see both of them get a title shot eventually. So bad news is that one of them's going to get pushed back. Good news is that the winner is probably going to find themselves in the title picture pretty soon, and that's assuming that the small possibility that this fight gets converted to a title fight doesn't happen. Another fight that was announced is on the December 19th card. Jose Aldo, coming off of his title fight loss to Peter Yan, is coming back. He'll be fighting Marlon Vera, who's coming off of the win over Sean O'Malley. Really big opportunity for Marlon Vera. It's kind of surprising that it took this long for him to get a fight announced after that O'Malley fight. He didn't really take a lot of damage against Sean O'Malley, and he had a lot of interest around him. A lot of people were cheering for him against Sean O'Malley, and then once he got the win, it seemed like a lot of people wanted to see him fight. So I guess bad news for him is he didn't get to fight right away. Good news is that the fight that he does get is against an absolute legend in Jose Aldo. Pretty surprised that Aldo's staying at bantamweight. Looked like he was having a hard time when he first made the cut down from 45 to 135. And you figured that once you had the title fight and then lost the title fight, it's like, why cut the extra 10 pounds if you're not going to be champion anyway? I guess for him, maybe he's gotten more comfortable at 135, which just seems kind of odd to me. Or maybe he just thinks that he's still pretty close and he can still hang. The fight with Yan, I mean, he had some decent moments there. He was throwing some leg kicks. He looked pretty good in the first couple rounds, I guess. Definitely as the fight wore on, it didn't look as good for him. Not sure that I see him beating Peter Yan again, and Yan is the champion. So maybe he thinks that there are guys like Sterling out there who could beat Yan, and maybe he thinks, like, I might not be able to beat Yan, but I can beat Sterling, and if Sterling can beat Yan, then I can beat Sterling. When Sterling has the belt, then I can be the champion. Maybe that's where his thought process is. I don't know what he's thinking there, because to me it seems like if you're not going to be a champion either way, you're probably making similar money in either way. Like, pick the division where you cut 10 fewer pounds. But he's staying at bantamweight, and he's gonna have a big opportunity here against Marlon Vera. For Vera, it's probably the bigger opportunity. If Vera gets the win here, he's going to find himself in the top 8 at the very least, if not higher. For Aldo, if he gets the win, it kind of confirms that he's still one of the best guys in the division at bantamweight, and he does have a name to him. So if he can put together a couple more wins, and depending on who's champion, maybe he does find himself in the title picture, which seems to be what he's thinking right now. And then we've also got Max Holloway returning against Calvin Kattar, which is a very interesting matchup. This is one of those fights where, had Holloway still been the champion, Kattar's one of those guys I was looking at as like being a very difficult matchup for Holloway, just because Holloway likes to box with most of his opponents, and Kattar is probably one of the last guys in the division you want to have like a boxing first game plan with. So it will be interesting to see how this goes. I don't think there's going to be a lot of grappling in this matchup. I think they are going to be in boxing range for the most part. Holloway was using kicks a lot more in that second Volkanovski fight. I'd imagine he's going to look to use kicks in a similar manner here against Kattar, but I really think there's a pretty good chance, especially early on, that Kattar's going to land some heavy shots on Holloway, and this could be similar to the Poirier fight in a way where Holloway is very good about making reads early on in a fight, and then as the fight goes on, continuing to gain momentum. But what happened in that Poirier fight is that Poirier would sting him early on, so time when Holloway would normally be kind of relaxed and making reads, he'd instead be like worried about getting hit one more time and potentially getting knocked down. And he never really had a chance to kind of settle in and start to flow, and that really cost him. I think if Kattar can hurt Holloway early, you could sort of have a similar fight to that Poirier fight, which, I mean, for fans is great. That Poirier fight that we just had was a fantastic fight. Everyone enjoyed watching that. It was fight of the night. Might have even been one of the fight of the year candidates. Actually, never mind. I don't think it was, because I think the actual fight of the year was the one that happened right after with Adesanya and Gastelum. But either way, it was still a fantastic fight. So that could be what we're getting here. But either way, it'll be a really fun fight to watch, and I'm definitely looking forward to it. So on to some more individual martial arts. So for wrestling, really unfortunate last year that COVID happened like the week before the NCAA tournament, so they went through the whole season. They went through the conference season. You had like all the seedings for the NCAA tournament, and they couldn't actually have it. Especially sucked if you're an Iowa fan like myself, because it looked like that would be the year for Iowa for them to finally win the national title. And then everything fell apart, and there was no tournament for them to win. But hey, that was back when it was 14 days to stop the spread, so yeah, it kind of sucks. You lose 2020, but you can come back for 2021 and win it all. And we're at this point, and 14 days to stop the spread is on like day 200 some odd. People just keep pushing things back and constantly changing it. It used to be that we're doing this so because we don't know a lot about COVID. Hospitals could potentially get overrun. We got to protect the hospitals. Got to give people time to set up additional resources. So that's back when, like in America, they were sending out like Navy boats to New York City. They were taking convention centers and converting them into hospitals. It was all, take this 2 weeks so we can make sure that we have enough resources in place to take care of everyone who's going to be flooding into the hospitals. And then we learned that all of this information about COVID was actually incorrect, that they were basing it off of bad data. Effectively what the data issue was is that testing wasn't available in very many places. So we were doing death rates based off of people who tested positive divided by people who died of COVID. People who died of COVID, they were still doing assumptions on COVID death. They're still doing that now, which is ridiculous. So there would be people who would be counted as COVID deaths who didn't actually test positive for COVID. They were just presumed to have tested positive for COVID. But then on the testing side, they were like waiting on positive tests. So you had a small numerator of people who tested positive, and then like a slightly inflated denominator of people who died of COVID. So we're looking at like these giant death rates when in reality those weren't accurate numbers. That's why cases have continued to go up, but deaths have not been going up at the same pace. If you look at like a graph of cases, like a line graph of that or a line chart of that versus the line chart of deaths, like if there was like an actual number where it's like 1% of people who get it will die, then you would think that it would be constant all the way through, but it's been anything but constant. But still, we're at this point where people had these thoughts in mind of how you have to respond to COVID that were back in March when we knew nothing about it. Now that we have new information, people haven't really made new rules, and now we're at this point where even though hospitals are not getting overrun, we're having wrestling season, which again, COVID hospitalizations for college kids is incredibly low. I think at this point, after like, I know like 2 months in, they didn't even have like, they might have had like single-digit hospitalizations, like 3, after like the first couple of months of kids going back to school. I think there have been, at this point, like a few more hospitalizations. I still think it's fewer than 100 over all the colleges in America. As far as COVID deaths go, I think there have been like 3, although again, that's people who died with COVID, not of COVID, and I think at least 2 of those 3 were people who had some serious underlying conditions as well. So with that being said, just the information isn't there to suggest that canceling wrestling season makes any sense or really helps out at all. But people want to keep doing that anyway. They're not going off of data. They're constantly changing it. It goes from we're going to control the spread so that we don't overwhelm our hospitals to now it's like, well, let's just get the cases lower than what they had previously been. It's not as though there's like an actual case number they're aiming for. It's just like this case number we have now is higher relative to other case numbers. Therefore, this equals bad. We're not really... We're just not being smart about this. So unfortunately for Cornell Wrestling, for Lehigh Wrestling, and for all the rest of the Ivy League, Princeton, and some other big schools there, their wrestling season has now been canceled. It seems like with that being the case, there's a decent chance that there could be some trouble for some other wrestling seasons. The good news is that football is going on right now, so we are seeing college sports. That means that for the Big Ten, which is the biggest wrestling conference, Big Ten football is going on right now. If they're doing that, it would seem like Big Ten wrestling could also happen. Are we going to get fans for those events? Probably not. We're still not seeing a lot of fans for Big Ten football games. But I'd say at this point I'm cautiously optimistic that we're at least going to get Big Ten wrestling. We're going to get some other big conferences in wrestling. They're still going to be able to move along with the season. But it's definitely something that we have to keep a close eye on, and especially in America. If Joe Biden does, in fact, get certified as the winner of the election once that whole entire process is over, it seems like lockdowns could be coming that could potentially cut off this wrestling season as well, and that'd be a real shame. It'd be a shame for everyone involved. It'd be a shame for the athletes. It'd be a shame for anyone who's a fan, especially if you're a fan of like Iowa, where you're like, hey, Iowa's got a team that can finally win it in 2020, and then 2020 gets canceled. And they're like, hey, well, we're still good enough for 2021, and then 2021, maybe that gets canceled. So all I'll say is I hope that COVID does not cancel the wrestling season. It's unfortunate what happened with the Ivy League. I don't know that any of those guys are going to be able to transfer and wrestle elsewhere, which is a real shame for them. You only get 4 years to wrestle in college. So to have one of those taken away, especially if you've already taken a redshirt year and you don't want to stay in college for like for 6 or 7 years, that's a bummer. But it's definitely going to be a story to watch, and hopefully this is the last time I have to update you guys on a major conference being canceled, but it's still worth mentioning. As for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, they got the no-gi pans going on right now. Obviously, with a lot of COVID restrictions, they're not able to fly in all the best guys from around the world, so a lot of the guys in these divisions are mostly American-based, but you still have a lot of really good guys out there. So the black belt weight divisions have concluded right now. The absolute division is coming up. As of now, when I'm recording it, it'll be starting in an hour, but I'm not going to wait another hour to give a recap on who wins the open weight division. But in the weight divisions, there were some pretty solid ones. Rooster weight only had 3 people in it, so maybe not the biggest thing there. I think at light featherweight, Lucas Pinheiro from Atos was able to win that division. Andrew Wiltie, pretty new black belt, he was able to win his division. I believe that was medium heavy. Lucas Hulk Barboza was able to win his division. He beat Giancarlo Bononi, who just won brown belt worlds. So this was his first tournament at black belt, or at least in no-gi. Got all the way to the finals at Pans, which is pretty impressive for him, before losing to Barboza. We also had Conan Duarte beating Tex Johnson in the finals. So we still got some pretty good matches here. It's not the same as what you would get in a non-COVID year, but still a pretty good tournament overall. So that covers it for jiu-jitsu. I guess also worth mentioning that though the IBJJF did begin to allow reaps and heel hooks, it looks as though in this tournament that rule is not yet in place. I did see some people get DQ'd for reaping, which is still really stupid, but hopefully that'll be fixed next year, and hopefully they'll go from just brown and black belts being able to attack the legs to also allowing people at lower belts to do it as well. It's always annoying when you're in the room and you have people who are like, oh, hey, this is illegal, like let's not do it. It's like, look, at some point, if you're going to keep doing jiu-jitsu, you're going to get to a point where you're going to have to know these techniques. So don't hide behind the IBJJF rules. Just learn them now and be prepared for when it actually is available. Or if the IBJJF decides to make a major change and makes it available at your division, don't be caught off guard. So that covers it for this week. I don't see why I wouldn't be able to be back next week. Just been really busy the last couple of weeks with stuff coming up. Again, Sunday's usually just the one day where I've really got time, and it really makes sense because Saturday nights are usually when the fights are, so Sunday's a good day for me to recap everything. But then once the week gets going between work and training and everything else, sometimes it's tough to take the time to record one of these. But have time this week. I would assume that I'll have time every week as I usually do before then. If not, I might have to take a week off again. But we'll see. I'd at least like to get to podcast 100 before I think about like going off of like a strict schedule of doing it once every Sunday, every week. So that's the plan, at least, is like get through 100 before maybe I do anything to adjust the schedule. So miss you guys the last couple of weeks. Good to be back, and look forward to covering the Blaydes versus Lewis card next week.